Hello, everyone. My name is Gregory Youdan. I am a queer, gendered, non-disabled, white Latinx man of Dominican heritage. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the research and advocacy coordinator for Dance NYC. I have been living and working on the land of the Monte Lenape people for 15 years in what is currently known as Manhattan, New York. I am currently wearing a black t-shirt with the words, "I am a New Yorker" for dance. I have short black hair and have a virtual blue background with the Dance NYC logo in the upper left corner. My personal background includes dancing professionally for many years, and I have a lot of research experience in dance science, especially with a dance for health focus. I work at the intersection of dance, health, research, and advocacy. For those just joining us, please visit our land acknowledgement on the agenda page and lift up the Indigenous lands that you are currently on in the chat. First, thank you for joining us, completely digital 2021 Symposium held on the Whova platform. As we are at the mercy of technology, we want to remind you that there may be delays, sound issues, and changing circumstances that may occur during our time together. We invite you to extend us and each other grace and patience. Second, an ASL interpreter from LC Interpreting Services and closed captioning services provided by the Viscardi Center will be available throughout the session. We will also post speaker information in the description below and under the speakers module on the left side of your Whova web app or in the menu of your Whova mobile app. This information is also available on our site. Third, feel free to post questions or comments you want to share with the community in the chat section of this event. Dance NYC moderators will be interacting with you in the chat audience. There will not be dedicated time for a Q&A during this discussion, but there will be a session follow-up chat room in the community section of the Whova, where the moderator and a few guests will be available for direct questions. Lastly, we hope you will help us to amplify these conversations, repost, tag us, and share your takeaways on Twitter at DanceNYC, Instagram at dance.nyc, and Facebook dance_NYC using the hashtag DanceSynth. And now we transition to Research Spotlight, advocating for the small budget dance makers. This session will unpack Dance NYC's recently released research report, which seeks to define the characteristics of small budget dance entities and offer recommendations to better support this large swath of dance makers best poised to lead much needed transformation across the ecology. I'd love to welcome Senior Consultant and Research Director, Carrie Blake, to give us a research presentation pertinent to this session today. Welcome, Carrie.
Hello. My name is Carrie Blake, pronouns she, her, hers. I am currently on the land of the Lenape and Canarsie people, now referred to as Brooklyn. I am a disabled white woman. I am wearing a black shirt. I have blonde shoulder-length hair with bangs, dark green glasses, and my background is white walls. And now I will share my screen to show some images relevant to the research. Five years ago, Dance NYC confirmed a longstanding theory in our field. The smallest organizations and groups represent the majority of the dance-making sector, but have disproportionate access to resources. The data studied for the last State of NYC Dance and Workforce Demographics in 2016 showed that the smallest organizations also have capacity to adapt to changing conditions over time, and that they reflect the diversity of the city better than larger groups. These insights brought forth so many questions around how this segment of the field functions despite disparities, what they need to advance, how they can be supported and protected, particularly given experiences grounded in justice. And those were the questions that led to this study, which was a 2-year research effort that began in 2019 and considered data and input in 4 stages. This next slide shows some squares that summarize those 4 stages. First, we analyzed background data from Dance NYC's Dance Advancement Fund, Dance NYC's State of NYC Dance and Workforce Demographics from 2016, and from Cultural Data Project. The results of that work informed conversations at a day-long conference for small budget dance makers in 2019. At that meeting, we launched a survey to collect specific data from this part of the field. That survey closed in January 2020 with 130 responses. In early March 2020, we organized a convening of Dance Advancement Fund grantees, a program offered by Dance NYC. And we also welcomed additional small budget dance makers to share our early learnings coming from the research conducted to date and gather more feedback on issues that required further exploration and discussion as we pulled everything together. And then our world changed. This project was initially timed to inform the implementation of Create NYC. That last conference research effort for this study occurred right before the shutdown due to the pandemic. So quickly we adapted to inform survival and reinvention strategies in response to the crisis caused by the pandemic, and then to align with and support the racial reckoning inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm going to give you an overview of the research, but I also want to say that one of the things that makes this report and research effort so special is that the data is enlivened by the voices and experiences of individual small budget dance makers in the form of quotes pulled from our convenings, essays from dance makers and dance workers, some of which are participating in this session today. But I'd like to invite everyone to review the full report, which is available on the Dance NYC website. The first section
here.
Yeah, we can pause here.
Thank you. I just wanted to insert a reminder to please slow down. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I should also note, I cannot see the chat. I can only see my slides.
Great. Okay, good to know.
So I won't see any warning, unfortunately.
Okay, no worries at all. You can come back in 3, 2, 1.
This first section of findings address what are small budget dance makers, or what are their characteristics. It's important to acknowledge that from the very beginning of this work, we explored the term small budget, and we really struggled with this variance. For us, for this study, it meant dance entities that vary in budget size, that work within budgets between $25,000 and $1 million. Our concern about the term ultimately inspired it to gain quotation marks. We really wanted to acknowledge its challenges and the opportunity to redefine it, particularly because those experiences of groups operating on either end of that range were so very different. So here are some of the findings about the characteristics of those entities. This slide, we show a chart that summarizes the data I'm about to report, which suggests that small budget is actually very small budget. Of 109 survey respondents, 78% have budgets between $25,000 and $250,000. 16% have budgets between $250,000 and $499,000, and 7% have budgets over $500,000. In addition, the $25,000 to $1 million budget range is not inclusive of most independent artists. This next slide also shows a chart summarizing data points that refer to the fact that most small budget dance makers operate a nonprofit. 74% utilize a nonprofit operating structure, while 22% use fiscal sponsorship. A small proportion, 3%, are for-profit or commercial, and 8% consider themselves to be independent of any structure. No survey respondents use a formal cooperative. We heard over and over that existing structures are challenging, and there was also some ambivalence on the topic, given a perceived lack of viable alternatives. For example, fiscal sponsorship, it feels very costly and sort of temporary. A 501c3 structure comes to a point where it feels disingenuous because folks often use it to access funds, and then they try to fit their work within the funding opportunities. This next slide includes a chart that summarizes the finding that 83% of survey respondents work with organizations and projects that were established a decade or more ago, with 40% having been established 10 to 19 years ago. So the majority of these organizations are well established and have endured over time. This next chart speaks to the location where small budget dance entities are headquartered. The majority, 83% of survey respondents work with organizations and projects that are headquartered in Manhattan. Just over a quarter are centered in Brooklyn. A notable portion, 11%, operate from regional locations beyond the 5 boroughs. This means that the respondent pool has greater representation in regional areas of New Jersey and upstate New York, more so than the boroughs of the Bronx and Queens, which are both at 6%. There were no respondents from Staten Island. This next chart summarizes genre. Small budget dance includes a vast set of genres. The 108 open-ended responses on our survey included 28 different genres, which were then classified into larger categories, revealing that 56% of respondents primarily work in contemporary or modern dance. The next largest genre is a national origin ethnicity-specific dance with 12%, which includes 11 different subgenres. Small budget dance makers are also highly reliant on social media, given its affordability and wide accessibility. More than 97% use social media posts for marketing and outreach, while 73% use posters, flyers, 50% use paid advertising, and just under 1/3 use community organizers for outreach. This next chart summarizes the funding mix for small budget dance. Nearly all receive funding from individual donors or earned income, while lower proportions raise funds from private foundations, government sources, and corporations. Notably, 68% of small budget dance makers that identify as Alana are accessing grants from private foundations as compared to 73% of all respondents and 82% of white non-Hispanic respondents. This chart summarizes funding needs. The majority of respondents, or 95%, express a need for funding for salaries and wages, with a similar proportion needing funding for general operations. More than half indicate salaries and wages as their most critical funding need. These needs remain consistent even through the pandemic, as revealed through our recent coronavirus dance impact study, which is ongoing. Survey respondents were also asked to provide input on needs not mentioned. The most frequently mentioned needs concerned fundraising, followed by travel and space. It's also important to note that priorities differed between identity categories. Alana, LGBTQIA, and respondents living in the Bronx and Queens identify operational costs as a top priority, while more immigrant, female, and Manhattan-based dance makers identify salaries and artist fees as top priority. This next section focuses on the characteristics of small budget dance leadership. And this slide includes a chart that summarizes the race and ethnicity of small budget dance leadership that responded to our survey. Of the survey respondents, 57% identify as white non-Hispanic, 18% as Black African American, 8% as more than one race or ethnic identity, 8% as Hispanic Latina, like Latinx, 8% identifies as Asian, and 1% as Indigenous. This chart summarizes place of birth, or the proportion of dance makers that are immigrant. Just over 1/4, 27% of survey respondents were born outside of the US, and these respondents were born in North America, Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, and East and South Asia. None were from Africa. This slide includes a chart that shows that no survey respondents identified as disabled, though previous Dance NYC research shows that disabled workers are indeed present in dance. On the one hand, it doesn't seem accurate given these findings from previous research, but on the other, we think it might be because this effort focused on leadership and suggesting that there are limited disabled dance workers in positions of leadership in the small budget end of dance. In terms of age, this chart shows that findings suggest small budget dance artistic leadership is mostly adults aged 39 to 55 or Generation X. More specifically, 42% of survey respondents were born between 1965 and 1981, compared to 32% of the nonprofit dance workforce and 21% of New York City. Only 26% of small budget survey respondents fall into the millennial generation, while 49% of the city population does. Baby boomers are well represented, with 25% falling into that group as compared with 22% of the city. However, only 5% of survey respondents fall into the silent greatest generation, which is born before 1945, as compared to 9% of the city, suggesting potential opportunity to better engage older dance makers. This chart shows gender. In the aggregate, gender identity. In the aggregate, 61% of small budget dance maker respondents identify as female, 33% as male, and 2% identify as gender queer or gender nonconforming. No survey respondents identified as gender queer, non-binary, intersex, trans man, or trans woman. New York City, for context, is 52% female and 48% male, according to census data, but the census does not include any gender identity categories other than female and male. This next chart summarizes the sexual identity of survey respondents. Nearly 1/3 or 31% of small budget dance makers identify as LGBTQIA, while 55% do not. The percentage identifying as LGBTQIA is higher than the nonprofit dance workforce, which was 28%. Higher than the New York City cultural affairs workforce at 15%, and significantly higher than the percentage of the population, the local population. This next section focuses on the dynamics involved in leading small budget dance. Artistic leads are affiliated with multiple projects and organizations over the course of a given year. This research shows that 85% are affiliated with more than one project, and just under 41% are affiliated with 5 or more projects. The majority of artistic leads, according to this chart, 53% do not earn a living from their work in dance. And the findings also show, as revealed on this chart, that 48% of artistic leads fill 4 or more roles for their organization or project. In addition to being in charge of the artistic side of their entity, nearly 80% work on fundraising, 76% on administrative roles, 74% function as the CEO, and so on. Volunteer labor. Small budget dance is highly reliant on volunteer labor. In fact, on average, as this chart shows, survey respondents report engaging 1 full-time employee and 20 unpaid volunteers over the course of a year. Paying artists is a priority for small budget dance makers. This chart shows that more than half of survey respondents, or 54%, engage 10 or fewer dancers annually, while 89% of those dancers receive some sort of financial compensation. However, paying dancers a living wage remains a priority. What are the experiences of small budget dance? These dance makers are more than just numbers. They long for change. We heard through our research, through input gained in the convenings, and also through open-ended responses in the survey, that they long for change that supports depth of process over product and value over volume. They share their need for knowledge, consistency, sustainability, inclusivity, and equity that will allow them to thrive. The urgency of this moment brings new light and depth to issues that we sort of already knew about, that were inherent in their experience making dance, but adds more significance to them. 2 broad issues came through the research. The first is around success. This chart summarizes input on how small budget dance makers redefine success, and they define it in terms of 6 priority areas. Much like small budget, the term success was also widely debated in study convenings. Small budget dance is frustrated with the notions that success for arts entities is defined by audience size, by number of commissions or positive reviews, and even movement from small scale to large scale, or from project-based to formal organizations. They would really rather move away from value, success, or worth defined by numbers, and instead toward definitions based on process over product, individuals over structures, depth of engagement, over breadth of audience, community accountability over funder accountability, and social impact over economic impact. The other major issues impacting the experience of small budget dance makers concern racism and inequality. Small budget dance makers shared that racism and inequality impact them both externally and internally. Externally, racism and inequality cause small budget dance makers to have difficulty attaining the recognition, independent and trust, to have inequitable access to philanthropic funds, to try to manage their work with very different levels of understanding and education around how to best legally protect, manage, and fund it. These issues cause small budget dance makers to prioritize resources to engage with and respond to funders rather than allocate resources in ways that benefit their work and individuals, and also to have limited opportunities for presentation and touring given the elevation of Eurocentric art forms and genres. Internally, racism and inequality lead to limited Alana, immigrant, and disabled representation in artistic leadership, work generated through oppressive structures, pressure to compromise artistry to meet financial needs and expectations, and as we saw earlier, a very high reliance on volunteer and in-kind labor. The characteristics, inner workings, and needs of small budget dance are unique. This segment is more diverse, resourceful, and nimble than the field as a whole. These defining characteristics are quite different and contrast starkly with the priorities of historical funding practices and the structures in which small budget dance works, as well as the capitalistic principles that govern art making in the US. So many needs and priorities were identified through this work, and we felt it was necessary to develop a sort of framework or criteria to help us guide the recommendations, provide a lens to ensure that they remain grounded in the realities that we were hearing in the research. The through lines for all three recommendations are grounded in three things. First, they all aim to advance justice in the field and address the effects of white supremacy and its tactics of oppression. Second, they address issues in the field with new depth, tone, and urgency in light of the pandemic and the resulting crisis. And lastly, they address the need for collective action beyond the dance field to support small budget dance. So the study resulted in three broad recommendations, which I'll summarize in a moment, but we did also want to show, as seen on this slide, the long list of stakeholders to which they were directed. And the study also includes a long list of action items for each stakeholder group, as noted on this slide. The first recommendation concerns the fact that we must value small budget dance workers as dignified laborers. Small budget dance workers are challenged by things like low unstable compensation, inaccessible medical and mental health benefits, lack of provision for the rest and the therapies that are required for their work, the need to fill so many roles, as we discussed and saw summarized on the previous research slide, the search for affordable space, which is also a key issue identified in the research, and then also the mental load that comes with navigating such an inconsistent and varied livelihood. At the same time, as we've discussed, the public and funding community put value on the final product over process. Also, educational institutions are providing training in forms and history, but not consistently around admin or financial training. And there is focus on investing in the arts as an industry, but not the artist. So the art is valued, but the art maker is not. And the value of dance work must be redefined and accepted as dignified labor. That can then lead to fair labor standards, including wages, work conditions, and working environment, centering the individuals. The second recommendation, create infrastructure that induces long-term equity and sustainability for small budget dance. Small budget dance makers really lament existing structures, particularly the 501c3, finding the system unsustainable and inequitable, which essentially leads to resource hoarding. They feel the ecosystem must be reimagined to be inclusive and not competitive, and the need for each entity to fundraise creates difficult administrative and artistic duality that sort of competes against each other and negatively impacts the work. So until the system is reimagined, These issues around structures, we feel, can be addressed in two ways. The first is to promote alternative structures in dance making. The second is to organize efforts to modify the 501c3. And this is probably a big undertaking, but the idea would be to require training for people to establish and lead 501c3 entities to better distribute power to address race equity issues. Regardless, any new or improved structure needs to limit the number of roles fulfilled by artistic leads, needs to combat anti-oppressive practices and inequities that are inherent in the system today, needs to support reparation, needs to limit reliance on private philanthropy, needs to be lean and nimble, and also include life cycles to make it easier and accepted to merge, consolidate, or dissolve. Dissolve is not necessarily failure. This begins with training, resources, and frameworks for alternatives within the field, as well as advocacy for the advancement and acceptance of alternatives. And lastly, the third recommendation. We must coordinate resources for small budget dance makers. This segment of the field needs administrative, fundraising, and marketing training and resources to support their artistry and aspirations while exploring the potential for new structures. Collaboration is a fundamental part of dance as an art form, and it also has great potential to support sustainability. The pandemic has already inspired new collaboration in the field, so we need to build on this to develop training and centralized services specific to small budget dance. Those might include training to support general operations around data, administrative functions, marketing and community relations, consulting and training for entities and individuals to address systemic inequity, robust diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility policies and practices, reparation programs, pools of human resources that allow entities and projects to expand and contract as they need to, potentially a leadership development pool, shared space, more consistent performance opportunities, the list goes on. And one more important point here, these resources need to be available to those working within and outside of formal structures. In closing, one of the most important takeaways from all of this research is that we should be inspired to move away from building institutions and instead focus on the establishment of new mechanisms and frameworks to center the individuals working within dance. By supporting the individuals and allowing them to thrive, the collectives, groups, institutions, and practices they work within will also thrive. Now, let's hear from the panel.
Hello. Just on a delay there. Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here. My name is Stephanie Acosta. She, her, and they, them pronouns are fine. I identify as a non-binary femme. I'm a Cuban American born and raised in Miami by refugees and immigrants from Cuba and the Caribbean. I'm a light-skinned femme wearing dark lipstick and a non-disabled person. I have wavy auburn red hair piled loosely on top of my small head with hoops and a thin choker around my neck. I am wearing a black dress with abstract green flowers. Behind me is my art studio with large white walls, shelves, and artworks in process and all the garbage therein. I am speaking to you today from Lenape-Hoking, an area currently called Brooklyn, New York, and the rightful home of the Lenape and Canarsie people. I live in a community that has been sustained through the indentured, forced, and slave labor of many persons, including immigrants entering our country through centuries and those forced into and descendants of chattel slavery. I want to state my solidarity for those who hope to be free and regain stewardship of their lands. Lastly, I want to acknowledge my rejection of white supremacy and my solidarity with those across our country and the world fighting for freedom to ascend and thrive. I commit to this lifelong work alongside those fighting. I also just had a quick note that I wanted to add. It started as a joke, but it's not. Trigger warning for small budget and money talk. I want to start by contextualizing the kind of difficult challenge and gross injustice that exists when artists are forced to battle for value and compensation while creating culture. We are all doing impossible work, and if you exist and are making work that doesn't yet define itself as small budget, or if you work outside of capitalist structures, you are seen, you exist, you count. The fact that we are going to be here talking about one part of the whole is not meant to erase the many other conversations needed. Thanks for being here. Whew, okay. that was my mouthful. So that was my self-introduction. And now I would like each guest speaker to introduce themselves and let you know who they are, and then we will get into it. Could we start with April?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is April Biggs. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a disabled, queer, white woman. I am calling from the unceded lands of the Kickapoo First Peoples, which is temporarily known as Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I am both an independent disabled dance maker, and I am also a dance worker with Creating New Futures. So I'll describe my room and myself. I am wearing a mustard and pink striped shirt. I have lavender feather earrings on. I have reddish brown long hair pulled back at the top a little bit. And I'm wearing glasses with a teal rim on the top and brown rim on the bottom. I'm sitting in a room that has a green, kind of a putrid green wall. And there's some framed art that has the letters MKE for Milwaukee on it in the background. Thank you.
Tiffany, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, happily. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Tiffany Ray Fisher. My gender pronouns are she, her, hers, but I do prefer just to be called Tiffany. I am calling in from the Mohawk Native lands, currently known as Lake Placid, New York. I am a Black woman with sister locks, cat eye glasses, and a plaid button-up top. The wall behind me is maybe a lighter putrid green than April's wall, but seems to be a theme. And I am the artistic director and choreographer for Elisa Monte Dance, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Ximena.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, that's NYC, and everybody for sharing time together today. My name is Ximena Garnica, pronouns she, her, hers. I have been living and working for over 20 years on the land of the Monte, Lenape, and Canarsie people, and known as Brooklyn, New York. I am a non-disabled immigrant woman from the country known as Colombia, a territory north of the equator, run through the Great Andean Mountains. I am wearing a maroon top, long black hair, and my background is a white brick wall from our studio, and I am also the artistic co-director of LEIMAY.
Thank you all so much for being here. I also just want to thank Carrie so much for such a great presentation and run through of such a complex, huge project. And for anybody that hasn't had a chance to really sit through, we're going to talk about lots of reasons why this data is so important and why being able to see what's going on with us financially is part of the system of getting ourselves back on track, or maybe on a better track. So I want to also thank Greg, who really created so much of the questions that I'm going to be using to guide our conversation today, and for providing just so much thoughtful research and support for me. So some of these questions are just, let's start with a simple one for everybody, which is just, all of you have had different sort of relationships to this, and now we've had a bit of a presentation. What part of this report either resonates most for you or stands out to you as something that you are either glad to be hearing about, or were surprised by, or were felt just like vindicated from hearing?
This is Tiffany. I'll start. I loved seeing in bold print too, I believe it was, that it was like that small dance makers make up the majority, but have disproportionate access to resources, because that's something that is known. And it's also, I think my frustration with it was something that it was known, but it was like, but that's how it is. And like, no, like I'm going to resist that. And so much of the work that I do within my company is resisting that and being like, nope, like that's not good enough. And I really don't understand what brought us to that place of complacency of like, well, that's just kind of how it is. But I love this report so much, and being able to just see like I've read it. I must have read it 15 times by now, just because it was just all of those things that you knew to be true if you're one of the, and I had a hard time because I don't identify as a small budget dance maker. I'm right in the middle of that scope. And so for me, I was like, what I'm able to do with like $500,000 is completely different than what someone with $25,000 is able to do, the same way that someone who has $1 million is able to do way more than I can. And so this document being able to take that extreme range and pull it into something that is cohesive and tangible with action items for multiple people in the sector was like, I was like, well, come on, Dance NYC. Like I was done. I was just spent. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk more about this and get more eyes on this, because it's such an important document for our field. In thought.
This is April.
This is Ximena speaking.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, April. Go ahead.
I just thanks, Ximena. I just wanted to second all of that, Tiffany. And I was looking at it and thinking, this is like we're looking at a bunch of symptoms of something. And obviously, as a disabled person in the field, and I've been in the field my entire life, and have really struggled with these different ideas of success, different measures of what makes one successful, because the field has been very inaccessible for me. Seeing that no small budget survey respondents identified as disabled was like, yeah, like, while that is like untrue, it's untrue that there are not disabled, small budget dance makers. That makes complete sense to me that we are not identifying, we are not self-identifying, because it's dangerous. It's punitive to identify, and which is one of those complications too of like what oppressed groups can pass or not pass, and what passing means. And there's a whole trauma to passing. So yeah, I'm with Tiffany on this idea that it feels kind of just like really looking at what is, and looking at, and also seeing what is not showing up in the information, in the data, and realizing that's an access point for us to start to dismantle all the oppressive systems at work in our field. In thought.
This is Ximena speaking. I echo April, like when and Tiffany in many ways. One, I see myself seen in that report. I am one of the small budget organization that for like over 20 years haven't been able to go over the threshold of the 250K. I am the one struggling to not know what the structure is, and then realizing after I am more adult growing up, like, oh, I needed a board. Oh, okay, that's what I need. Or I need a development director. Not having the training, just kind of learning. I remember when I was 19, I bought the book, Nonprofit for Dummies. I read all these books, and then it saved me many things. But at the end, it doesn't save you from systems of oppression. And when I look at the report, I felt like, oh, wow, I'm not the only one, but I also felt extremely sad because it also the solutions are there. And it's just a matter of implementing them, and not in a 5-10 year plan. It's starting to implement it now. And I think COVID make that possible, that we can actually switch very quickly. It's not easy, it's jarring, it's difficult, but how we make these quick switches now, starting now. So the report was that, but also what April will say, I was also, who is not here? I mean, not everybody's making contemporary dance. What is contemporary dance? What are these places of non-Eurocentric views of dance, and why are they not here represented the same way everybody else is being represented? So it was like a beautiful, harsh mirror that it's obviously not showing us all the landscape, but it's, if the founders needed data, you have your data now. You don't need to collect more data. Let's just get to work. Let's make the changes.
Stephanie speaking and snapping into the air. That was really, all three of you, so great. I just already broke my hand writing about 20 questions. I feel like we're actually already angling towards this idea, so I'm just gonna lean into it, which is questions of, Tiffany mentioned that in your company, you're actively resisting that certain ideas, and I'd love to hear more about that, how you're doing that, how you wanna do that more, what you need to do that this helps sort of articulate. And Ximena talking about like the solutions are there. I just like would love to hear a little bit from and I think April also, this kind of thing of when we can, I love this way that you have of talking about it as symptoms, because it's so much harder to deal with an undiagnosed illness. It's so much harder to deal. And so I think even in the painfulness, there is so much relief in being witnessed. So like, how is it to be witnessed, even if the information is not really what you want? So that's kind of a few ideas, but if the three of you could kind of communicate a bit about those resistance strategies or what you see as solutions that you're amped to push forward, I'd love to hear it. And Tiffany,
sure, okay, great. So this is Tiffany speaking. So I took over Elisa Monte Dance from the founder 5 years ago. And what was really interesting is that I didn't realize I was like, had just enough knowledge to be dangerous. Like that was kind of my entry point, which ultimately I think ended up being a benefit, because I just didn't believe, because we had been doing things this way, that we needed to. And so I didn't have any type of internal resistance around the past in that way. I didn't feel tied to it. And so one of the things that I really felt passionately about was that my dancers get paid on the 15th and at the end of the month. Just that. I mean, this is not a revolutionary concept by any stretch of the imagination, but it's more rare than I would like it to be in our field. And so the structure before of the company was one that I think most companies have, where you have multiple weeks on, and then maybe a couple months off, and then maybe 2 weeks on, and then 5 weeks off. And so it makes it very hard for the dancers to have whatever survival jobs that they have, because it's understood that there's a survival job that's needed. So one of the things that I did is I just broke up the week. So we work Tuesday, Thursday, Fridays, but we work Tuesday, Thursday, Fridays throughout the entire year. And the dancers have a designated 6-week break, 2 weeks in the fall, 2 weeks in the winter, 2 weeks in the summer, so that they know this is what we're doing. So on Mondays, do whatever you want. Wednesdays, do whatever you want. Weekends, if we're not out touring, do whatever you want. And I really stick with that. I do not deviate. Even if I'm like, oh, I have it, like, you got to wait until next week on Tuesday when you see them. Right. So that was the first thing. So payroll and schedule were huge. The other thing that we have for the dancers. We have a dancers wellness fund that they can pull from every trimester. I genuinely don't know why it's in trimesters, and that's something that I should look in, because I don't know. But just basically, they have, each dancer has X amount of money allocated to them. They can go get body work done, submit it, and it just gets deducted and it gets re-upped. And we have a junior board whose dues go specifically to that. So there is a group of people that are like, yes, we understand that to do this work, body maintenance can't be a privilege. It has to be part of what's expected. And so the company needs to provide that. And so that was born from our junior board. And last but not probably, I don't want to say most importantly, because being able to get paid is very important. But I went for a culture shift. I really wanted to make sure that anyone that came into our space, meaning our offices, if you're a student of ours, like if you're a company member, if you're a board member, whoever that is, felt seen and heard by me. And so there's a lot of dancer input around the decisions that, like, what projects I take. Like, I came with that, when I wanted to change the schedule, I went to them and said, does that actually work within your life? Because it worked. It would have worked for my dance life, but I'm on the other side of this now. Does this work for you? So that I wasn't creating systems for people that weren't able to give their input. But I think having a very open and honest relationship with my dancers is a game changer. And some, you know, they really take advantage of that. And sometimes that's hard to hear when you're like really working and it's like still not enough. But I would much prefer that than them suffering in silence. And it's a good ego check for me, because my board is so incredibly supportive that I could easily have a queendom working full autonomy. And so there has to be a balance somewhere. And so being able to have a supportive board is great and incredible, but being able to have that check-in with the dancers and they know that we talk about what the year looks like, what worked last year. And at the end of the year, I have evaluations, like sit down evaluations with each of them. And the contract only lasts a year, and you can get out of it. But I think just being able to sit down at, like, every other job, you have year-end evaluations. Why isn't that standard here too? You have exit interviews. Why isn't that standard? That's valuable information that you can help to better the environment for the people that make up your organization. And so that I really started looking at industries outside of our own to see what were the best and better practices there, and how can I easily bring them into this nonprofit world. And I have to say, it has been highly successful. And it has changed the way I think about everything, just everything. And although the job is not any easier, it is far more enjoyable. And that really matters. Like, that really, really matters. So I think that's the end of my thought, and I'll pass it to another panelist. Thank you.
Hi, this is Ximena speaking again. So you use the word, Stephanie, resisting and solutions. And I feel like in my case, I'm being an immigrant, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary artist who make works with the body as the root. So choreographer, director. But I don't belong to any legacy of the New York City dancing, or even the United States legacies of dancing. So somehow with my partner, and thankfully, because we have this converted garage space that we fought for it, we've been able to cultivate our practice, our craft. And of course, there is a legacy. We have legacy from our mentors, from where we come from. But we had to almost like shelter in our place to be able to kind of cook and figure out what we're making, what we like. And in a way, it was lucky because the nonprofit became, because we didn't know what the nonprofit thing was when we became nonprofit. So it didn't, it was good that we were just so focused in our craft, because we didn't let that structure to affect the way we were actually building our craft and creating our craft until a certain point. Then there is a point where the circulation of resources doesn't happen, and you're getting older, and you want to make sure that you provide for the community that you're working with, that there is a circulation of resources that is fair. And the nonprofit stopped us for that because of all the things that in the report are highlighting. But one of the things that for us is important is that, so we have to then think about what is art, because if funders are going to somehow measure our impact and we're asking them to make investments. So one of my big solutions is like, well, no more project-based funding, make long-term, large, meaningful investment in entanglements. And you have to read my essay in the report to see what I mean with entanglements. No more trickle-down funding, gives the money directly to the artists and their entanglements. And why I'm saying this, like for me, our making, who is defining our making? The people who are invested in the labor of the craft, or the powers coming from the top-down system of capitalism and extraction. And then as a member of my entanglement, I am speaking from the place of the artist maker, but I'm also a human, and I'm also a public. And my entanglement is not only made out of humans. So when we are making art, we are questioning, we are woven, we are unraveling relationships. And relationships with who? Sometimes relationship with human beings, familiar with strangers, sometimes relationships with non-human beings, like objects, with materials, with plants, with animals, with architecture, with those who are no longer here, with our ancestors, with their legacies, with spirits, with the unknown. And your funding criteria should not determine the relationalities that we choose to center our craft on. Your criteria is doing that, and that it's not fair. Also, your measurement stick has flaws. It cannot be the same measurement stick that you use for economic assessments of power or that other industries use. Because you know how I'm creating, what I create, I don't know why sometimes, and I cannot control the impact. But I am constantly caring on the how, because I am invested in care. My investment that I have is on care, and I'm learning how to be a better, or a human being, not even a human being. So how do we determine how you measure somebody who is invested in care and in becoming human beings? You have to see it on the table. Sometimes even one-to-one, every entanglement will be different. It will require more time. It will require customization of situations, but definitely these entanglements, these relationships that I'm invested, they're important because they are providing, or not even providing, they're asking questions that lead us into knowledge. But this knowledge is not scientific knowledge all the time, you know. And this knowledge, it's to understand what is different from us, how we can coexist. It's an embodied experiential knowledge, and sometimes this knowledge leads to questions of power. Yes, sometimes it leads to activism in social realm. Yes, sometimes it's just personal revolution in the realm of the intimate, and sometimes it's just about empowering ourselves to ask questions, and you know, it's not always utilitarian is what I'm trying to say. So this knowledge is not always utilitarian, and it's this utilitarian power is claiming every inch of our existence. So how we look at measurements that are in line with this kind of values that I'm speaking. Sorry, I speak too long, but I wanted, it was hard to articulate this. Ximena out. Ximena, end of thought.
Thank you, Ximena. This is April speaking. Whoa, both of you, like, there's just so much flooding my mind while you were speaking, and I love this idea of entanglements, like thinking about the relationality of our work. And I do think that there's a lot of work to do for us within our field, and how we have, as choreographers, as performers, as teachers, as, administrators, how we have internalized colonialism and capitalism, and how we expect, even as we're trying to make revolutionary change, we're still leaning into capitalistic structures. And disability justice is a framework that I invite people to look at, because it's a framework that was built by disabled, BIPOC, queer folk, right? So it's like this fundamentally intersectional framework. And one of the things about disability is that we have had to find ways in our community to practice differently, to practice outside of capitalistic paradigms, because we can't, there's in many ways, whether, and disability, encompasses a very large realm, but like if we kind of look at impairments and neurodivergence and chronic illness, for example, right? There's many other ways we can look at disability, but that those things require us to slow down. And I think of Timo Okune's, white supremacy culture, and how it talks about urgency, like just this like thing about capitalism that's just about productivity and urgency. And in the work that I do as an individual artist, and in the work that we're doing in Creative New Futures, we're looking at that pretty often. Like, how do we balance radical access and slowing down with like oppressive structures that we need to push back against with some urgency, right? How do we find that balance? One of the structures that I'm just going to share something that, so the way Creating New Futures, I don't know if people know about Creating New Futures, but I'll just give a blip of an introduction. But Creating New Futures was the phase one of Creating New Futures was a document that was built by several people in the field. And it was a reaction to how, when COVID happened, everybody lost their gigs. Everybody lost money, and it was devastating. And people came together to really look at all the oppressive structures in our field and where the power lies, like we've said, primarily with funders. And from that document, another phase of Creating New Futures came out, which is what I'm a part of. And there's several working groups in that. One of the working groups is the Disability Plus working group. And we made a request of the entire collective that if a request came out for something, that we all get a week to respond. I mean, that in and of itself is like a radical shift, right? Like that it makes it just, I mean, even for all of us, like these things have been so internalized that, it's like, okay, what does that make available when we slow down like that? And also, what kind of panic does it cause? Because we're not meeting some kind of measurement of productivity that we've been taught is what we have to meet. So yeah, those are the things that came to my mind when Tiffany and Ximena were talking, just thinking about radical ways to shift our culture. End thought.
Tiffany, did I see you go like this? Did you want to say something?
No, I was just emphatically agreeing with everything that was happening, and I'm a hand talker, so I'll try to keep that under control. Sorry.
Stephanie speaking, and that was incredible, all of you. Again, we can just keep going. You're answering also so many of my questions all by yourself. You're just getting there. I would love actually to talk a little bit more about creating new futures, if we could, April. And part of something that is also standing out for me as you're talking about this is how this report is relaying and relating so much to capital at its center. And so, yeah, I'm interested in how creating new futures is tackling that radicality and that sort of like that urgency for a slowness, that sort of living, that contradiction, and what maybe what you're really excited about also that relates to some of these topics that might tie people in. And folks should definitely go out and read phase 1. It is excellent.
So this is April speaking. Thank you, Stephanie, for that question. Yeah, I think in some ways, because of the creating new futures has been disorienting in a way, because we're trying to do things that are not modeled, like at least not within like settler colonialism structures, right? And so there are times where we're, as a collective, we aren't even like an organization, we're just a collective of people. Like we literally are just a big group of people. There's times where we're lost and we're kind of like, what are we doing? Because sometimes we're still just trying to figure out how to do what we're trying to do. I mean, there's clear things that we are doing, you know, like we took big action in the last few weeks with solidarity with Emily Johnson, you know, over the Montclair situation. And we have working groups that are building intersectional riders and contracts, right? So there's very like stuff we're doing. But what's most interesting to me and exciting to me is the intersectionality work that's happening, that is complex and ever evolving. And, you know, particularly, I think Creating New Futures phase 2 decided, I don't know, like a couple months ago to center BIPOC people and disabled people within our group and within our practices. And so we had a disability justice teach-in for everyone. We're also having a white caucusing happening, so we can take some of the, you know, I'm a cursor, so I've got like curse words running through my head. Just take the bullshit of whiteness out of the space, right? So like, and then there are people, myself and Dakota Camacho, if you guys know Dakota, the two of us have a lot of conversations about the intersection of like Black or BIPOC non-disabled people and white disabled people. And that's sort of like, how do we work together and not, because we are both the oppressed and the oppressor. Mm-hmm. Like all of us are both the oppressed and the oppressor, right? And so how do we find ways to hold each other with grace and, you know, minimize our harm towards each other? It's really complex. And so I think that's the work within Creating New Futures that feels really revolutionary for me, is that we're staying in that conversation, and it is difficult. Yeah, in thought.
Stephanie speaking, thank you so much for that. I think what you continue to talk about, slowing down, is also interesting because it does come up in all of this language around moving disabled folks to the fore and under, but I feel like every single measure twice, cut once is something I've been saying so much lately, and that the frantic nature of being under-resourced creates a difficulty. How do we meet expectations of equity and ethics that we ourselves want to have when we're a $25,000 company? Who's getting paid in that? And who are we villainizing when we start talking about that? When are we yelling at the manager when we need to be yelling at the owner? So for me, that was something that really stood out in that range, is that, Tiffany, when you talk about how what you have, and you also came into a structure that existed. So in some ways you were able to apply a reform approach rather than Ximena's careful building. So it's such a different laborious task, but they both seem so laborious. So I think what I'm trying to formulate here is maybe an opportunity to just talk a little bit about that kind of the question and of this kind of the impossible ethic conversations and time, and how to do that when that is also labor and we don't always have money to compensate those things. Or, I'm just thinking a little bit about like the labor of negotiating and trying to meet these expectations is also related to this kind of funding. So I'm wondering if you all have either tactics that you've been thinking about, more expansions on some of what you're talking about now, but also within that, or demands from funders of what would make that more possible. Of course, we understand money in general, but anything beyond that.
This is Ximena speaking. Well, I think I'm going to focus on the funding because I don't want to put the burden right now on the artist, and this is a forum for the report. I think there is the question of rhythm and time and circulation, and then the resources of how those resources are circulating and in which pace they are expected to circulate and for what. And sometimes the work that we do have different, art has impact, and sometimes it's like person X learned X and it affected X. But sometimes it takes centuries for an art object to impact society in a massive way. Also, sometimes the impact is in a very personal level, and sometimes you maybe never know about what the impact is, because the whole point with art is like we're dealing with things, the potential of things. So with the funders, like one thing is that there has to be a movement into trust. They have to start trusting these entanglements. And when I mean entanglements, it's group of people coming together, like creating new futures, or like LEIMAY or Elisa, Monte. It's not about the structural organization, but the entanglement, the community that decides to work together to share knowledge and to circulate and create culture and be better human beings. So in this case, we have to tackle, the funders have to ensure that these entanglements that they fund, that hopefully they are funding it in a long-term, with long-term investments and no project base, that they're funding directly, not through middlemen or middle institutions, that they are also engaged in anti-racist and racial justice practices, and they have to fund ways to actualize those practices. Otherwise, we just can't. And also, they have to ensure that they are providing, that the people they're funding are providing a living wage to the artists, employees, consultants. So entanglement like ours that is so small, unless your investment on us is large enough to achieve those goals, living wages, anti-racist, racial justice practices, then you're going to put the burden on us to dismantling system of oppression. And it's not fair. We are already the oppressed in that system. And another point has to do with how you divest or redirect your funding. If you're funding right now organizations, larger organizations that are not engaged in these anti-racist practices, there has to be certain accountability that needs to start happen now. Like if you see mainly leadership that is a white leadership, that maybe they have BIPOC people, but in like committees or councils of color of people, but in the decision-making places, or they're creating positions, random positions for the people of color to come in. Are those positions really necessary? or what is needed is a transfer of power, and you're just hiding the transfer of power by creating these new positions. If you see the little pie statistic of how much money administrations are making, how much money is going to the artists, and if you see that this is a big discrepancy, like the artists are really in the end of the tail, this is not fair. These institutions, all these things wouldn't existed without the labor of the artists. So yeah, I stop there because I'm sure you all have things to say. Ximena out.
Thank you, Ximena. This is Tiffany. I think for me, I will stay on the funding side because I absolutely agree. Let's keep applying pressure where the pressure needs to be applied. I think the getcha gotcha for me with the funders was like how quickly when COVID hit, it was like, oh, you don't have to get that in. Oh, we can just do this. Oh, and so at first I was like, this is amazing. I'm so excited. I can think. But then I was like, you could have been doing this the entire time. Like, so I've been jumping through hoops that are like lit on fire and are being raised every 5 seconds when you could have simply just said here, because that's what you're doing now. And thank you for doing that. But also I'm very curious of like, what about COVID? What is the question? I'm curious, like, what was it about COVID that all of a sudden allowed the funding community, like the whole community was like, it just tipped. And so I don't know if it was just having actual conversations with your grantees and they were like, oh, that's all going on. Like, I don't know if it was just conversation. I don't know if there's actual empathy entering the room. But I felt so conflicted because I felt equal parts excited and duped because it was so fast and we had been told to be patient and we're working on it and we're trying. And if you can just hold off and we've been patient and we let you sort your thing. And then it was just one day. And I was like, wow. So I don't know, I'm sure Dance NYC has a funding panel during the symposium, but like, that's what I'm really curious about is that I applaud you, but also I'm super pissed. Both parts, both and equally so. And so like, that is the reigning question for me because the work that we're talking about doing can't turn on a dime. The work that I'm doing, the work that April's doing, the work that Ximena is doing, the work that Dance NYC is doing cannot turn on a dime. But this sector within this industry has shown that it can. So then now we know, right? We cannot unknow. We've peeked behind the curtain. And so I'm wondering on our end too, what's the, like, or I don't know who's in, what's the accountability to make sure it doesn't backslide once theaters are open. Once dancers can dance, I'm not going to spend half of my time filling out this because I know a new way now and I'm not going back. So what does that do for my financial stability of my organization? Because now I can say no. And because I've had better results with less labor from me and my work has never been better because I can put my energy in the work. And that's what you're actually funding. So that's not even a full thought, but those are some things that are going through my head in this moment. So in thought.
This is April speaking. So I don't have much to add because I think you guys just handled it really beautifully. That, we can't unknow what we now know, and that's brilliant. I also just want to nudge a little bit, like that made me think about, this may not be the appropriate moment to like kind of weave this topic in, but I will say that, the disability community had been working virtually for a long time. You know, we had found other ways to work. And I think that's been a thing within the community itself. It's like, oh, now we all know we can work this way. And we place all these values on it. Is it as, you know, is it dance? Is it what it, you know, we have all these values about whether or not it is or does not measure up to what we think the aesthetic of dance is. But I think that that's for some of us, like, okay, what's going to happen when COVID's over? Like, will the disability community then be sort of like pushed back over here to the margin of like, you guys do your thing over there? And I think that that's it feels similar. It feels like it's in a similar conversation. And there's something really striking to me about it, because often disability in dance has been thought of as sort of like able-bodied dancers teaching disabled communities dance. And the shift now is like, no, disabled dancers participating in the dance community, like equitably, right? And that to see us as full humans in a dance company might require adaptations and adjustments within the company structures, right? So anyway, that feels tied to that, Tiffany, even though it might not be exactly that. It feels like similar. And I'm gonna do what Ximena did. April out.
I just want to add something, Ximena speaking, that Tiffany, I think also that apply. I know we're talking about founders, but that applies also to presenters. The shifting of programming, they're responding with the immediate needs of the community now. So, you know, when you're asking us to work 3 years in advance, again, this is capitalism models of economic business building. We are not doing that. That is not what we are making. So we really have to make sure that we reevaluate the relationship with time, funding, programming, creation, working, all of it. And if the other industries are not doing it, then the arts ought to do it. Then it's our responsibility to hold that for humanity.
Stephanie is speaking and enthralled. That was so great. And I've been wondering that so much too, April, this question of who's going to be left out when we quote unquote return to normal, and this idea of like a return and the assumption that people want to return instead of switch. And, you know, I'm not really supposed to be a person because I'm a moderator, but it, you know, in my life too, it's like every single thing went away, and I sort of was lucky that I had other things that I also did in my life, which was usually a critique about my lack of focus, and was the only reason I was able to pay my rent. And so it just became this big question of like, when can we talk to those presenters again? I was like, those presenters didn't care about us. They were happy for us they were not worried at all. And so I think that's also part of it, is this, something that Tiffany said also about accountability, and this question of, maybe it was Ximena actually, of like funders also checking in with who they're funding and auditing based on these ideas, not only responding to these ideas, but taking on these kinds of demands as part of the requirement to continue funding. And that switch is something that feels really necessary. So I guess maybe one of the last things I kind of wanted to try and get in here is this question of how thinking about, as sort of Greg has written here, like reducing barriers, and thinking about how to engage artists in different parts of grant making was one of these questions. But I think that the question of openness maybe is like, how do you feel, Tiffany, maybe I'll ask you this, your ability to sustain what you've created and shifted even before the reforming of an open door, you know, when we think about sustaining, how much of the conversations that the three of you are in right now feel like they are about sustaining new structures, and how much are about reforming new structure, like, you know, how many are about like really like we're already in something new and we're building, and how much is it that sounded terrible. I'm a bad moderator. Yeah, I guess I'm a little, I'm in the entanglement, because what I really want to hear, I guess, is a little bit about optimism, the inevitable need for hope for us to be able to sustain and re-engage, and how this report, both it makes us sad and it makes us feel capable. So here's my question. What would you say to someone who's getting started now, who's walking into these systems now, while they're in this messy reformative potential, in some ways? Like, where would you point someone first, or what would you want that person to, what would you want folks to put at the front of their mind now, because you know it's possible? Maybe that's where we can kind of wrap our thoughts in something like that, send people off with abilities.
Yeah, I love that. This is Tiffany. Centering joy is part of my artistic practice, so like I'm here for it. I think what I would encourage people, if they want to do something, now is the time, because in the best way, everyone is shook, right? So make moves, because like you can't go wrong, and this is the time for, like, allowances will be made during this time. So like, come in big, come into the sector and the field big, come in bold with audacious ideas, because we might be able to do it. And just that like idea that it's like all of the things that we know to be true didn't exist until they did. Right? Just that idea. So for me, having like impact in this field is crucial. So as we move forward, thinking about what is our impact and how can we expand that impact is the most exciting and thrilling idea, because no one is coming to save us. And that's freeing. Like, we're not here to just be like, wait to get saved. Like, no one's coming. It's us. So if it's us, like, what a wonderful position to be in. And when we look back at this time, to be able to say our participation changed that from here on out, because of what we did, there was a before and after this mark. And that is, I really can't even sit down. Like, I get so, so excited about that idea of just sheer audacity, because we can right now. In thought.
I love that. Tiffany, this is April speaking. Yeah, like I think I hear that and I love it. And I think of that from a disabled perspective too, like just do it, you know, just throw it out, you know, like just try, just work, make your art. But I also think about as a white person on this panel, I think about like, there's a real need for the white people in our community to deal with their shit. So like, that's a piece that just stays with me, is like, you know, I'm hopeful that however we got to this moment, COVID, you know, the murder of George Floyd, all that, like, and all the many murders before that, but however we got to this moment that we're hoping is like a pivot. I'm hopeful it is like a pivot, and that there will be a before and an after. And I think it's critical for the white people, white identifying people in our community to do the serious, like, anti-racist with self work. Like, that has to be a critical piece of how our community can move forward. And we need to follow the lead of the most marginalized in our community. You know, I've been in spaces where it's like I speak about access and then there's like a question and I'm like, I'm telling you the practice. We don't need to discuss it. And it's the same thing, you know, with racism. If BIPOC people say, here is the practice, white people don't need to have a conversation about it. Like, follow the lead. So yeah, end thought.
I love the excitement and passion that Tiffany, you were calling for. Just come in, ball with audacity. I think focus on and I think that the passion that make us go into this journey of life of radical living radical imagination, right? We imagine, and it has to be radical. And when we imagine radical, then suddenly we materialize that. So, like, trusting your radical imagination. I know that sometimes it feels like you're like the salmon, like swimming against the current. Like, I feel it, you know, like sometimes I look and I'm like, oh my God, it's been 20 years I'm in this country. I still feel like a baby, and I still don't have money to pay my dancers, and I still all these things, and it feels daunting, but then you have your community, because you're building, you're weaving, you're invested in care. So come with passion, but as you are passionate, ensure that you're caring, and you're caring about the relationships with all living beings and everything, and that includes your food, your parents, your family, your space where you work, everything. I think if we have an intentional act on engaging with our art with care, then we're gonna instigate that care, and you're gonna get hopefully to the funders and to the powers and to policy and politics and all this. So yes, this is the time. I love this idea of a before and after. I mean, this is amazing. This is a real this is a global pandemic. This is a huge event. We are lucky to be here today alive. Many are not as lucky, right? We are grieving the loss of many people. So we have to make our life count.
Wow. Stephanie speaking. Thank you so much for that, all of you, for those answers. I love this enthusiasm, and I think I hope that anybody that's watching us right now and taking this in will go and spend time with this report, because it's not just numbers, it's not just information, it's not just stuff that doesn't, even in its failings to represent every single person, it will give you a sense of what we're tackling. But also here you have 3 folks really tackling it from different angles and making it happen, and that it's not separate from your passion to figure out how to ethically sustain and care for yourself. So I really, and others, I really appreciate all 3 of you and everything that you're bringing. I could talk to all 3 of you for an endless amount of time. Dance NYC, give us a talk show, like, we're ready. And I just want to say, as I start to wrap us up, that there's such a huge gratitude that I have for the Dance Symposium and for conversations like this, and that these reports are reflections that are there. They both exist from conversations and are there to give us things to discuss and demand. And I just really, I'm so glad to have 3 such different perspectives gather and strengthen a sort of clarity around all the ways that we're in this together. Some of us on separate boats, but we're still on this water. So I'm grateful for all of you, and I'm glad to see you healthy and able today to breathe. Yes, and Greg is going to now give us our outro. My thanks knows no bounds. So appreciate you. Thank you, all 3 of you, so much. Folks, check them out, check out their bios, read all about them. There is not a limit to the extent that just these 3 folks are already doing. So thank you, everybody. Greg, take it away. Stephanie out.
This is Greg speaking. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Like you, I could have listened to that conversation all day. And thank you to our full group of speakers, to Carrie, Tiffany, Ximena, and April for today's insightful conversation. To our attendees, thank you for being avid contributors and offering your insight in all of the ways. A final thank you to our funders and sponsors and our accessibility service providers, Carlotta Caracci from Viscardi Center, and Gloria Vargas and Emilio Garcia from LC Interpreting Services for their invaluable support. Feel free to head over to the session follow-up in the community section and to continue the conversation. So what's next? You can continue to experience the symposium. You can visit our sponsors in the exhibitor hall, create virtual meetups and online conversations at our community board. You can message other attendees and engage with the symposium thematic guides in the digital program book. Today's transformation thematic guide was curated by Yanira Castro, who will also be leading the daily debrief session we have coming up next. Go to your Whova agenda to navigate to the debrief session. After that, we will have a wonderful dance break with Krishna Washburn leading Dark Room Ballet. Get your bodies moving after this full day of panels and important conversation. This will be followed by our virtual expo showcase, where exhibitors will go live to the booths with info sessions and more. Tonight's programming ends with a pivotal keynote conversation titled Studio to Stage Pipeline, A Story of Racism, Tondus, and Black Death. Leading the conversation is our wonderful moderator, Dr. Gregory King, joined by speakers Melanie George, Maura Donahue, Devola Huron, and Jesse Phillips Fine. Have a wonderful debrief session, dance break, virtual expo showcase, or take some off for yourself, and we will be in community with you tonight for our keynote. Cheers. Thanks, everyone.